I grew up in small town Northern Ireland. It's not a particularly exciting place, but I was actually fascinated by science from a fairly early age, which most of my friends were not, which immediately makes you slightly odd and a bit of a nerd. And I remember nowadays when my kids were little, they'd know the names of every dinosaur, whereas when I was a kid, they didn't, and nobody was interested. And you know, it was just, and if you did, you were kind of weird. I guess there probably was a bit of that right from the start. I drifted for a few years, worked hard in the later years, got good grades, and in Northern Ireland was not, in the 70s, was not a particularly entrepreneurial place. You know, you didn't think about going into business, you didn't think about private industry, you basically, jobs were all in the government. You know, so you either did healthcare and went into the National Health Service, or, you know, whatever. The only other thing really that was popular if you had good grades was law, and I really wasn't interested in law at all. I think if I hadn't done medicine, I would probably have gone into engineering, something like that. So I went to medicine in Belfast. You know, as a medical student then, you got a structured curriculum, but in the clinical stages, you spend a month going around each specialty. You know, you do cardiology, neurology, and ophthalmology. And when you go to some of these departments, they say, oh, the medical students are here again, what are we going to do with them today? You know, and you go to ophthalmology, and Professor Desmond Archer, who actually trained in Belfast and Chicago, is quite a motivational individual, an inspirational individual, had set up a very slick program for the medical students. There was a book, there was, on day one you do this, you do that, you go round, here's a slit lamp, this is what, and it was poles apart from my experience going through some of the other clinical departments. So suddenly, whoa, this subject's interesting, it's well taught, it's innovative because, you know, you get intraocular lenses, which in the early to mid 80s were still relatively novel. So you know, corneal transplants, lasers, you know, there's a whole lot of exciting, you know, boys' toys, and a mix of medicine and surgery. And it was very well taught. It seemed to, you know, just fit the bill completely. So I decided as a fourth-year medical student that it had to be ophthalmology. That was it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not usually that decisive, but so then I just worked towards that after that. There are options in your curriculum that you can choose to, for instance, once you graduate from medical school in Britain, you then do house jobs, and you don't have a great deal of choice, but you could choose them to move towards something that would be relevant to where you were going to go in your career. For instance, I did some general medicine and neurology because I thought neurology would be especially useful in ophthalmology, so I did 6 months in neurology, and then I moved into ophthalmology 2 years after graduating, which is kind of the norm in the UK.
And then what?
Then I left Northern Ireland. I had cabin fever. So I was gonna go to England for a couple of years, and that was 37 years ago, I think, if my maths is correct. And I ended up eventually at Moorfields Eye Hospital. The first mentor was Susan Lightman, who was a uveitis specialist at Moorfields, who encouraged me to get interested in uveitis, and I did a couple of years lab research with her. But at the same time, she introduced me to John Dart, who was an anterior segment specialist, but a particular one who did a lot of complicated surgery, a lot of complicated corneal grafting and things like that. And he saw real, you know, the really difficult patients. And that actually I found very inspiring, because these people who really needed fixing, and he could do stuff that, you know, fixed their problems. So I got more and more interested in that. And at that point, during my residency, I applied for a corneal fellowship at Bascom Palmer on his recommendation. And you say, yeah, a corneal fellowship, really? Well, yes, I did. But in the interim, these patients all had bad glaucoma as well. And I ended up doing a glaucoma year at Moorfields while waiting for the corneal fellowship at Bascom Palmer that involved working with Roger Hitchings, who was like my next inspiration. He taught me how to do tube implants, and we were using Multinos at the time, and that also was fascinating. But glaucoma surgery at the time was pretty rustic. You know, there was Multino, and no one did very many of them, so the technique wasn't wonderful and they were very unpredictable, or trabeculectomies. But so that was a very formative year before going to Bascom Palmer. So I then did 15 months at Bascom Palmer, where I got to know Don Boudens, and we started a research collaboration on amniotic membrane transplantation in glaucoma, because I was working with Schaefer Seng in Bascom Palmer, who was starting his work in amniotic membrane at the time, and I got me the chance to actually work on his initial publications. I think one of them is still my most cited publication, and that was 1995 or 96. Then with Don, we took it into glaucoma, and we had a couple of publications on amniotic membrane transplantation in glaucoma surgery. But the collaboration with Don then went on, because the Bascom Palmer was a huge benefit, because even though I'd done a cornea fellowship, I ended up being involved in the Bascom Palmer glaucoma surgical trials. Because when I was there, I got offered a glaucoma job at Moorfields, even though I was doing a cornea fellowship, because I'd done a glaucoma year before I went. And there were a lot of people looking for cornea jobs in the UK at the time, and they were basically handing me a glaucoma job on the plate, so it was a no-brainer. So I took the glaucoma job. Then, having come back from Bascom Palmer, where everyone was using the Barveld implant, to the UK, where the Barveld implant was owned by Pharmacia, but none of the Pharmacia reps had even heard of it. So with much badgering, I got them to bring the Barveld into the UK in 1999, and they started in Europe. And my career after that was a lot of time trying to tweak the technique to get it less of a white knuckle ride, much more predictable, using various ripcord sutures and external ligation and stuff. So over the years, I worked endlessly on my own Barveld implant technique. Why? Well, you may say, this is difficult, unpredictable operation. Well, why? Well, because I'd got a practice that had a lot of uveitic glaucoma, a lot of secondary glaucomas, a lot of people with scleral buckles and silicone oil, and I found something that worked. The Barveld actually worked. Prior to that, my clinic was like a bleb repair shop. We were doing trabs and repeat trabs and more mitomycin and more repairs, and this was like an endless cycle. The Barveld actually worked. I found something that worked. This is like, so I spent the next X number of years trying to make it not just tie it off and leave it, but trying to get it so you get physiological pressures from day one. And we kind of succeeded, because a lot of the time you could, but not all the time. There were still patients with very high pressure, very low pressures, but in general, we got it to be much more predictable. And that meant that the threshold for using it went down and down, so you're doing it more and more and more. We still had trabeculectomies, and then I suppose then later on, around 2010, I guess, the newer procedures started to appear, and I was involved with Aquasys, I was an early adopter of the Zen implant, and with InFocus and the PreserFlow microshunt, which I do use quite a lot of, although my practice has been more limited to more advanced, more secondary glaucomas who really just need fixing, rather than let's do something and do something else and do something else. So I've ended up being more of a tube surgeon than anything else. I remember when I got my first SHO, senior house officer job in ophthalmology at St Bartholomew's, my colleague that I trained with, Tim Matthews, was telling me about this thing, the Maltino implant. I'd never heard of it. And then it defined my entire career, which is kind of, well, not actually the Maltino, which I've done quite a few of, but more the Barveld and more recently the Paul implant. But it did that whole glaucoma drainage devices became my gimmick, so to speak. I mean, Roger Hitchings at one point said, "You need a gimmick," and I, what are you talking about? I just see patients like, and it turned out, ironically that turned, it's just the way things went, because the patient population I happened to be referred. I worry about the increasing trend to transaction-based surgery. You're doing things that you get paid to do rather than focus on things that work, and that is a big concern. And there are fewer and fewer people getting trained to nail the condition. and an increasing myth that it can't be nailed, that you just keep doing something, do something else, something else. You know, with proper training and adequate surgical volume, you can fix a lot of these patients. I inherited a lot of patients from Roger Hitchings when he retired from private practice in 2005, who had had trabeculectomies in the mid-90s. Now, that was at the time when mitomycin was just coming in. So these weren't the world's most wonderful blebs. But the point that I noticed was that these people, who many of whom I'm still seeing 20 years later, who've now had their trabs for 25, 30 years, they would have pressures of 7 or 8, and they were not getting worse. And these are people who would have bad visual fields because they maybe had pigmentary glaucoma picked up in their 40s with pressures in their 40s, because in those days in the mid-90s when he did the trabs, the optometrists were not particularly screening for glaucoma as well as they do now, or some people just never went to an optometrist. So I started seeing these people in 2005, and the blebs may not have been the best in the world, and they might not have been the most comfortable, but the patients didn't want you to touch them because the pressures were 7. And years later, their fields are not getting worse. And that had a profound influence on me, because I realized that the myth that you don't need to get the pressure down doesn't make any difference. If you can get patients down to high single figures or low double figures, pretty much they won't get worse. And over decades. The exception to that, I think, is I see people in their mid-90s, and sometimes they getting worse no matter what you do. But short of that, it's very rare, I think, for anyone to deteriorate if you can get them into single figures or around 10, assuming that the cornea is of average thickness. So I think this is a myth that you can never fix it, and progression's inevitable and the pressures will always go up. I think if that's the case, you're not doing the right surgery, or you weren't trained to do the right surgery, or you don't have enough volume of the right surgery to be good at it, or maybe you just don't get paid to do the right surgery, and that's a bad trend. And innovation at the minute is focused on the big commercially attractive market, the mild glaucomas. And the only thing really that's been there for the advanced glaucoma is the Pole glaucoma implant, which I got a plug because I co-designed it. But I have to give credit to Paul Chu, National University of Singapore, because he was the driving force behind it. And I must say, when he invited me out to get involved in the Pole glaucoma implant, I thought, oh, this is never going to happen. And in fact, it happened. And my only real input was to tell him to make the tube small so that we damage the cornea less and hopefully erode less. What actually happened is it turned out to be a bit more predictable in the Barvelt, which we never anticipated. The smaller tube seemed to dampen the pressure fluctuations in the early postoperative period, so we don't seem to get the extremes. Now, it varies from batch to batch, and some are tighter than others, but we had that with the Barvelt as well. And I've heard with the Amid valve, you can get variation as well. So I think that has been very satisfying achievement. We've got something, but it's only been around a few years, and it's early days, and and I don't think that's by any means the end of the road. What's happening now, I've noticed, is the canal space is filled up with lots of different devices and techniques and so forth, but the subconjunctival space hasn't. There's only been the Zen and the PreserFlow, and I kind of thought industry was losing interest, but they haven't. There's at least 3 companies that I'm aware of with new MIBS, or minimally invasive bleb surgery devices. In fact, there's more than that. I think 4 or 5 that are. So that space may transform, and that is the space that still offers the best chance of efficacy in the long term. The suprachoroidal space is one as well, but it's just so hard to tame. So there is hope for the future. I think it was just luck. I happened to latch on to something that I found that actually worked in a field where a lot of people believe that nothing works. They don't believe it's worth the effort. They think it's too complicated or whatever. And I found something that worked, and then what you want to do is you got something that worked, but it's not perfect. and everyone knows there's all sorts of complications with the Barvelt and and all the rest of it. But it worked well enough that you should be able to. A lot of the complications were technique related, and it's simple plumbing. It should be a way of you should be able to titrate it and get it to work better. So I just spent my career like, well, point one is it works, so now we've got to make it work safely. It's as simple as that, and that gives you something to drive for, especially when you get a lot of patients being referred. Initially, when I started doing these, I put in a tube, and the referring doctor said, "You did a tube? Why?" And then after a while, it was said, "Dear Keith, please do tube." So over the years, things changed. I wanted to be an expert in something, I wanted this field, this small area that I knew everything about. I find that very satisfying. So I find this aspect of glaucoma surgery. I thought there's something I can focus on and try and make things better, and just try and be good at it, and that I just find satisfying. And if you've got something that you've kind of made your own in some respects, or your own mission in life, then you just keep going. I ran competitively as a student and at school, and it does, if you're running competitively, I think it makes you competitive in every way, and that training's hard. I remember as a first year medical student, I was running 8 miles a day and 15 on the Sunday, and the only thing that happens when you do that is you become a better runner, but you also can't stay awake in lectures. So then I had to back off the running because, and end up I needed a career. But it does, that if you're involved in that sort of endurance sport, I think it makes you more tenacious. I once told there's a patient that I was a lady. I once said for some reason or other to her that I was quite tenacious, and she looked at me and said, "Keith, stop complimenting yourself, you're just stubborn." You have to have grit in cross-country running or distance running. You have to have grit, and the same if you're cycling. And I cycle, and anybody who looks at my social media will know I like posting the cycling, but it's always in the rain or the fog or the snow, because I tend to do most of my cycling in Northern Ireland, and it's not California. It's definitely not California. Oh, the international stage. Yeah. That was Roger Hitchings. I would Roger Hitchings used to get invitations to everything all over the world. And he would say, "Keith, I'm not going to this. Do you want to go?" And he'd stick my name down. And then the organizers would kind of begrudgingly accept me, as Roger Hitchings' substitute. I don't think that any matter. He said, "Professor Hitchings said I could do this," and they said, "Oh, okay," and they'd send me the cheapest ticket they could find, and then I would go. And then eventually I started so I worked like crazy on the talks to try and justify my presence, and eventually I started getting a lot of my own invitations, but it was Roger Hitchings who put me on the stage internationally. I was in a car with Kuldev Singh going to Don Boudin's Arvo party in 2012. And I'd been running what's called the Moorfields International Glaucoma Symposium, running annually, which still runs actually. And Kuldev noticed that and said, "Well, you need to run an innovation meeting." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he told me about this thing called Glaucoma 360. I said, "There's nothing like this in Europe. We should run something like this in Europe." So we set up Ophthalmology Futures, which based roughly on Glaucoma 360, an innovation meeting with panels, startup pitches. And we set it up for the first time in 2012, and it's been running ever since. Except it's not just glaucoma. We run a retina forum just before EU Retina, and we run our European forum, which is everything except retina, just before ESCRS. So that way we're not selecting companies out to present according to whether they can pay or not. We're not selecting them according to companies we want to promote either, because we don't own any of them. So, and it's not a huge meeting, but it's proven very successful over the years, and this is something that is really fun to do as well, and very interesting, because you see the startups at the early stage, and then you see how they progress, and it's resulted in me working with a lot of startups over the years. So my fellow Nathan Kerr, my ex-fellow Nathan Kerr from Melbourne, and I set up a registry, a web-based anonymised registry of glaucoma surgery in 2018. What we realized was that electronic medical records don't have the same granularity for post-op interventions, complications and things that we would like as glaucoma specialists. They tend to be a bit more generic. So we set up a registry which now has a large number of surgeons who put in a small number of patients, and a small number of surgeons who put in a lot of patients. But in the last few years, we've accumulated almost 8,000 operations and 40 to 50,000 follow-ups. I presented yesterday on the iTrack canaloplasty registry. That's basically our registry. So we provide the service to certain companies, and it's been exciting because it should give. So my aspiration is that it'll provide a perspective across the whole glaucoma surgical spectrum, from trabs, tubes, your eye stents, hydrus, canaloplasty, omni, GAT, CPC, everything, Zens, we've even got eye stent, endoscopic CPC combinations. We like every single thing you can imagine. And if you get, some surgeons who do a lot of this and some surgeons who do a lot of that, eventually you get a kind of a topography of the landscape of what works, and it'll be interesting to see how the canal procedures perform against each other. Now, obviously, the companies we work with don't want us, showing that their device is not as good as the competitor. We're not doing that. I think this is a long-term project, a few years down the line when we've got a couple of thousand of this, a couple of thousand of that, and you can then look and you can get a much better perspective of where things are going and where things should be going. So that's another project. And there's no more projects because I can't fit them into a day. There's an awful lot of social media geared towards new innovation and new techniques and minimally invasive surgery. There's almost nothing on traditional and conventional surgery, on tubes, trabs, revisions, how to do hard stuff, or outcomes post-op follow-up. There's a very, very low level of follow-up. Most of it's, I put in this, looks great, complications, things like that. So I have a YouTube channel, glaucomasurgery.org, glaucoma-surgery.org, that was designed really to promote how to fix this, how to fix that. You see that for cataract surgery. There's lots of complicated cataract surgery stuff on YouTube. There's hardly any of conventional glaucoma surgery. And I wanted to promote conventional glaucoma surgery, repair techniques, how to get out of sticky situations, things like that, which I felt was lacking. So one line summary, well, I got involved in too much stuff, but it's all great fun.